Hey guys, welcome back. We're continuing with Refuge Recovery, a Buddhist path to recovering from addiction by Levine. We're continuing with part 2 of this book, Reflections on Recovery. Sorry for the dim lighting. Circumstances have it that this is the lighting I have for today. And also, if you hear very rambunctious roommates, just know that they are amazing people and you would be blessed to meet them. But rambunctious they are, and rambunctious they shall remain. Reflections on Recovery. The following are personal recovery stories from members of our Refuge Recovery community. We have included these stories for those new to recovery to get a sense of the various ways in which recovery happens. You are not alone in your suffering, your confusion, or your path of healing and recovery. And today we're talking to Mary, or speaking her story for her, chapter 18 of this book. Let's see. The music a bit. I grew up in New York City with a schizophrenic mother. It had an impact. My dad passed away when I was 5, and my 2 older brothers had already moved out of the house, so it was just me, my mom, and a scary and overwhelming world. Everything was my responsibility, but I didn't know what to do. For a while, Mom was somewhat functional, at least on the outside, but the house was always falling apart, a disaster that I couldn't handle. Couldn't allow anyone to know that my mother was the way she was and that our house was horrific. I kept the outside world and world inside my house separate and made sure that the two never met. Now, my higher self is telling me I should probably point out to people what schizophrenia looks like if you don't know. I myself wasn't aware of it. I had an idea. I knew that they heard voices in their head. I actually had my own run-in with it recently, not me, myself, and I, but in the last year and a half, I had met a wonderful man that had certain criteria that, not knowing the criteria, I didn't know till after the fact, when someone that knew the information about schizophrenia, a very wise woman, Soul's Eye Jules, what's up, had interviewed me on it, and her having been a psychiatrist for such patients, she informed me that what I had been dealing with was schizophrenia. Ultimately, what it comes down to is that, they do hear things in their head to the point where they get paranoid, and once they hit paranoia, it can be horrific. I didn't have to deal with horrific, but I definitely had to deal with the imbalance of it, and it was heartbreaking to witness. In retrospect, I would have, now knowing, dealt with the situation differently, because I was just confused. I thought it was just because he was a stoner. It's like, but it's a very difficult thing to deal with, and in short, what Soul's Eye Jules taught me is that it needs to be medicated. And if it's not medicated and it hits paranoia, it can be dangerous. So that is my own personal input on what schizophrenia can do, which probably explains a bit as to why this Mary here described it as horrific, her mom being schizophrenic. But back to the book. Everything was my responsibility, but I didn't know what to do. For a while, mom was somewhat functional, at least on the outside. But the house was always falling apart, a disaster that I couldn't handle. I couldn't allow anyone to know that my mother was the way she was and that our house was horrific. I kept the outside world and world inside my house separate and made sure that the two would never meet. The more the house's walls started to fall down around me, the quicker I built my figurative inner walls at a very early age to protect myself. The inside world of my emotions moved behind this wall because no one could ever know anything about that either. Ever. I see pictures of myself at age 7. They show a little girl getting plumber and plumber. They show a little girl who found refuge in food. I remember going to the corner market and buying candy bar after candy bar. The man behind the counter looked at me and said he hoped the candy was not all for me. I lied and said no. I had found solace in food, and hiding in shame followed me there. By the time I was a teenager, my mother's paranoid schizophrenia, the paranoid part I spoke about earlier. By the time I was a teenager, my mother's paranoid schizophrenia had taken its final hold. She lived on the couch and listened to the messages on the TV. She believed people were keeping her riches from her and that the comedians on TV were making jokes at her expense. When I broke my arm, she thought I did it on purpose, so the hospital could get some money from me. She was my responsibility, and she was my fault. It was such a mess I barely survived high school. I honestly don't know how I did. After graduation, my brother invited me to come live with him and his new wife in San Jose. I said yes, and they sent me a plane ticket. I left New York, left my mom by herself, and went to the promised land. Northern California in the early 1970s was party central. I was 18, my brother and his friends were 30, and I immediately became a grown-up. Everything was wonderful. I no longer suffered or stuffed my face to fix the pain, but there was bottles of wine, tequila and whites, sheets of acid, and kilos of dope. I thought I was in heaven. In California, I started to get my life together. I got a job and went to college. But my drinking and drug use really took off there. I was in a relationship with a guy who liked to drink as much as I, so everything seemed fine for a while. But the walls I had put into place when I was a kid were pretty solid by then. I had no idea how to be in a relationship. I kept waiting for him to read my mind. Needless to say, it didn't work out. I have to add 2 cents here. When it says, I kept waiting for him to read my mind. The polar opposite of that is when people think they can read your mind, and they're incorrect. Don't allow either one of those behaviors in your life. It's unhealthy. Needless to say, it didn't work out. I went off to Israel with a group of people from the California State University system and proceeded to party for a year. Now that's a bit strange for me. I never thought of Israel as party central, but when I got back, I stumbled along into a dysfunctional relationship for a couple of years. I could take the car and drive up to the redwoods and dream of being anywhere but where I was. I drove, but it was never far enough away. I was drinking, but food had come back as a way to cope. After 2 years, the relationship ended and I graduated from college at the time. I hadn't figured out what else to do, so I kept going to school. I moved to Los Angeles, where I studied archaeology at UCLA. Somehow, I earned my master's degree, so I kept trudging on in the PhD program. This is a PhD candidate talking about her addiction. Just wanted to point that out. If you don't see the hugeness of that, please do. But drinking a whole bunch every day and graduate academics didn't mix well, and drinking won out more and more. I knew I was an alcoholic, but I told myself it was okay because I was not hurting anyone but myself. Around this time, I got arrested for drunk driving and was sentenced to attend some 12-step meetings. I went because I had to, and kind of enjoyed them, but the word God made my skin crawl. I knew it worked for others, but I was not interested. I had gone to Catholic school for 12 years, which is probably why she wasn't interested. But I turned my back on God, little g God, at an early age because it never made sense to me. The idea of a life without drinking was unfathomable, so I kept on. Again, rationalizing that I wasn't hurting anyone but myself. I started falling behind in school, and when I was offered a full-time job, I snapped it up. I told my professor I was taking some time off, but for all intents and purposes, I closed the door on archaeology, something I loved. I told myself it was no big deal and drank more to forget about it. I started living in a little single apartment. I was on my own for the first time, and my life got smaller. I went to work in the morning, came home, drank, and passed out. I would sit and drink and listen to music and tell myself I was happy to be alone, that I didn't need anyone. At work, I perfected a little Mary Sunshine persona. Everything was always good and wonderful, and I was happy and shiny and perfect. I know in hindsight that I thought I had to be that way to fit in. Any messiness would not be accepted. Any imperfections would be dealt with harshly. Deep inside, I felt very broken, so being alone was my only answer. I could be little Mary Sunshine for 8 hours a day and crash and burn for the rest. The walls got taller and thicker. In spite of my isolation, I got involved with a guy from work. The relationship did not go the way I wanted. We broke up one night. I found myself sitting out to get even with him. Whew! I knew how to hurt him, and I did. I won't go into details, but I do remember realizing the next morning that I had crossed the line. I realized what I had done, how I intentionally hurt him. The lie I had been living about only hurting myself had been exposed. I admitted to him that I was an alcoholic, mostly because I learned that was a good excuse when my behavior was really bad. Ooh. But something within me had changed, because I would disappear from the relationship. And this time I knew I would have to do something about it. I didn't drink for 2 weeks, which I was proud of. I felt good not being sick and hungover every day. But after 2 weeks, I grew so uncomfortable in my own skin that even though I didn't consciously feel the desire to drink, I drank anyway. I know today that I took away my only coping mechanism, but did not replace it with anything else. I'm going to pause there because that's massive. When you are changing your habits, your way of thinking, you have to fill that void with something new, something better, something healthier, something more aligned with your true self. Because if you don't, that void will be filled by what was previously there. The discomfort became too great. I was off and running again. I needed to get help again, so I found myself back in a 12-step program. They still said that word, God. But this time, my skin didn't crawl. I felt some hope. I found myself going back day after day, and I found that I remained sober. This recovery program was my lifeline. For my whole life, I had felt the need to keep up a smiley persona on the outside while I hid everything on the inside. The 12-step program showed me I could admit that I needed help without having to open my mouth and actually say the words out loud. That's the best I could do at the time, and it was enough. Slowly, I absorbed what was being said at the meetings, and I got involved. I found someone I could trust to work with, and I made a commitment to tell her what was going on inside. I heard them say you only had to change one thing, everything. But honesty was what was required. I'm going to say that again. I heard them say you only had to change one thing, everything. But honesty was what was required. I found a new way of life and was able to begin the healing journey. As I got more and more involved with meetings and the 12 steps, the fog lifted, which let me see how my fear and my natural instincts for survival created so many of my problems. I started to chip away at the walls that kept me separated from the world. Though I was never able to connect with Judeo-Christian ideas of God, I was able to define my higher power as a group of drunks. And I slowly began to trust others. I learned that I was not the center of the universe, and it became a daily task to remember that fact, because we're all part and parcel of God. All of us. Give or take a few weirdos, but I'm talking very few there. From very early on in my recovery, I took some time each morning to be quiet and reflect. Sometimes reading or writing or just sitting. At some point, I began a very simple meditation practice of breathing and using mantras such as, quote, let go, end quote. And I just want to add another little thing here. I use this app called Fabulous, which I mentioned in one of the other videos. And just like 6 minutes of yoga and drinking a whole thing of water, like a whole bottle of water, and making sure to meditate for like 11 to 15 minutes, that's half an hour of your life. I guarantee you, especially the yoga, that few minutes of yoga every morning, it will change your entire day. It'll sure as hell get your morning started in a fabulous way. So I understand what she speaks about here. Just those few minutes in the morning can literally get your chi going in your energy going in the right way. I highly recommend it. Of course, the serenity would disappear once I left my house at the yoga, and it won't. But that quiet time has remained a constant in my life. Life went on and recovery continued. I got married and held a job. I moved through life with a willingness to change in some respects, but was incapable of seeing how to do it. I still thought I had to achieve something to be okay. I had to be the top performer at work. I thought I had to be perfect in my recovery. I thought I had to have the perfect home, the perfect marriage. I never believed that anything I had or did or said was enough. Especially hard to do if others around you criticize you and tell you that something's wrong with you. Make sure to stay away from people like that. It's important. Or blame you for what they're feeling. You want to stay peaceful? Stay away from people like that. For a time at least. Until they feel or recognize that they shouldn't put things like that on other people. I never believed that anything I had or did or said was enough. I always felt like I had to figure out everything in my own head before I made a move. I lived this way without seeing it for many years, experiencing the discomfort of not being enough and still being on the outside, looking in. Along with this sense of an inadequacy was a non-stop soundtrack of comparing and judging. Now, if you've been in my channel for any length of time, you know that one of the number one ways to stay in peace is that no comparisons or judgments are needed on my part. If you can remember those few words, no comparisons or judgments are needed on my part. You will do more good for others and for yourself than you can possibly imagine until you try it. And I like to thank the intenders for having come up with that. Intenders of thehighestgood.com if you want to know more about them. I lived this way without seeing for many years, experiencing the discomfort of not being enough and still being on the outside looking in. Along with this sense of inadequacy was a non-stop soundtrack of comparing and judging. And I was never on the plus side. The walls had diminished a bit, but they were all still there. Even with years of sobriety, I felt trapped at times. I had learned to open up by working with others, but only to a certain extent. It took me a long time to realize how much of an impact my growing up had on me, and how thick those walls were, and how I hid inside of them. I would look around and see others sharing at a deeper level than I could. Women would share things with me. I would never dream of telling someone else. I told just enough to get along. And within the prescribed parameters of what a sponsor or sponsee could or should share. Outside of those parameters, it was still too scary to open up, too scary to even acknowledge anything. On the spiritual side of things, I never developed a belief in my kind of God and continued to resist that piece of the 12-step program. I would simply ignore the talk of God, and I still considered my higher power as something over there that I had no clue about, but knew it wasn't me. Prayer, so important in 12-step work, was never a tool I used or something that made much sense to me. I had nothing to pray to, and I did not look to anything divine to fix me. Sometimes, however, I did feel a momentary sense of calm and ease when I could totally let go into the moment, in spite of what was going on in my life. And that's the goal, guys. When I read Start Where You Are by Pema, Chödrön, and I did order that book last night, so I will let you know more about it. I also ordered another book she's going to mention here. Thank you, Kindle. So I'll tell you more about those as I start to read them, and if they hit me the way they hit this lady. Well, that's a weird word. If they resonate with me as much as they resonated with this lady. In spite of what was going on in my life, when I read Start Where You Are by Pema Chödrön, I was amazed. I ran around waving the book at everyone and yelling, "This is my program! This is my program!" After 19 years of sobriety, however, 19 years here, wow. However, something still wasn't right. I was deep in my program and involved with the group and with others. I worked on so many of my runaway instincts and had built a good life, but there were dark places that had me so very broken. I couldn't explain them. A number of things happened around this time. My outside experience were good, but inside was bleak. And there was still a dramatic separation of the inside and the outside, and I was uncomfortable. During a regular mammogram, they found a small lump and wanted to do more work. In other words, energetically, she gave herself cancer. I believe that that's how disease brought from unease happens to our bodies. The body keeps the score, and if you don't clear out your spiritual and your mental self, it's going to affect your body. I retreated further inside. I told my husband, but no one else. They did a procedure, but it was inconclusive, so they had to do another one, a little more invasive. I still told no one. I didn't even want my husband to come to the hospital. "I'm fine. Leave me alone," I told him. I would spend hours in my head dreaming of running away. The thought of dying was actually pleasurable. This line of thought made perfect sense. Leading up to this, I had spent almost a year going through Sharon Salzberg's, that's Salzberg's, Lovingkindness. That's the book title, and it's all one word. It's the other book I ordered. Every morning, I did the practices, and I noticed a difference in how I felt towards others, specifically people I once felt neutral towards. Wow, this stuff worked. At the end of that year, and around the time of my monogram, I found the Dharma Punk website and saw an announcement about a New Year's Eve intention setting ceremony. And for those that may not have seen some of the other videos, the Dharma Punks, which is DHARMA Punks, PUNX, 2 words there, by Noah Levine, that's Levine. It's his other very popular book before this one. Website, and saw an announcement about the New Year's Eve intention setting ceremony. It sounded really good, so I went. The place was packed, and I didn't know a single person there. My intention to have more compassion for myself came out spontaneously. I was shocked by the words I heard myself saying. In other words, her higher self was telling her to love herself. To have more compassion for myself came out spontaneously. I was shocked by the words I heard myself saying, but was so touched by my experience that I was determined to go to the weekly meditation classes that Noah Levine had set up in Los Angeles a few months earlier. I went once and knew I could not stop going. My life changed again. Formal Buddhist practice took the recovery program I had developed through the 12 steps and my own experience and sharpened it to a precise edge. Ideas that were partially formed before, such as staying in the now and being with life as it unfolded, came into focus and were outlined and delineated in such a way that I couldn't imagine this practice not being part of my recovery or my life. These practices became tools to use to continue the journey. I had been floundering for a few years, and now, finally, the path had been opened, and the work was just beginning. Now remember, this is 19 years into her sobriety. Don't wait that long. Try these out, okay? Especially if you are working the 12 steps. Try them together. There's good in everything. See how many tools, such as these programs, you can use, such as meditation and yoga, that you can incorporate into your life to make your sobriety, your happiness, your sense of ease stick. I have hit wall after wall in practice. Daily meditation, had extended periods on retreats, have helped me melt the barriers that self-preservation built. For the first time, I started to look at the impact my early years had on me. And through meditation, I was able to sit and begin to see how those experiences conditioned me in a way that I could not have seen otherwise. I had spent my whole life in my head. I kept running to food or drugs or alcohol to keep the pain away. With meditation, I allowed the feelings to arise and learned to be quiet with them. For so many years, I had listened to the stories in my head, and although I knew they were false, and I tried to power my way through them, I couldn't. Occasionally, I had breakthroughs where the experience moved from the mind to the heart. But here were tools I could use specifically to address my recovery. Not just recovery from my physical addiction, but tools to enable me to heal at a deeper level. The walls I put in place began to dissolve with the patient application of mindfulness. The willingness to look at what arose inside, whether it matched the story in my head or not, was the effort the Buddha talked about that was necessary for liberation. The Buddha taught that we don't get out of this life without pain, but I had spent my whole life avoiding it. I was diagnosed with the human condition and finally was able to turn and face the pain. The grasping for something out there to fix me was never going to work. Turning inside to heal is where the practice occurs. The first healing was internal. I learned it was not self-indulgent to bring compassion to your own experience. In fact, it was the answer. Not lame, but strong. Oh, who knew? Grief, anger, and shame saw the light of day for the first time, and I welcomed them. But this is not a practice that promises instant gratification or permanent bliss. As I continue to live and breathe and stay willing, mindfulness and effort allow more insights. I hit another wall a few years later and found that the old ideas of self were still strong. They still kept me from connecting with others. I went into therapy to help me clearly see what was happening, what was keeping me from other people. Another wall came down. So once again, it's not one thing or another. Your journey, your plan to reach your highest good for yourself and hence for everyone around you will be specific to you. Seek, try things, Everything from sacred medicines to yoga to nutrition to the 12-step program. Who knows what the answer will be for you? Except you. You will know, and you will have to take action steps and try things and actually put yourself on the line and do action steps and persevere. Who's going to heal you if not you? It'll take work. But victory is there if you keep seeking it. Find your peace. Nothing in my past has changed. Nothing about my story has changed. What has changed is my ability to see the habitual patterns of thinking that kept me suffering. The habitual patterns of thinking that kept me suffering. Dissatisfied or stressed or off kilter, or however you want to translate dukkha. And I don't know what that is. It must be a Buddhist word. It's spelled D-U-K-K-H-A. My perception of the facts is ever shifting. My ideas are dissolving. The practice requires a conditional effort to feel whatever arises at each moment. Continued focus on each moment requires more and more subtlety and feeling of each moment. What is this? Ask that. What is this? Question mark. Becomes the question of the moment. Becomes the question of every moment. And the new response is kindness, rather than a search for a way out of the present, however justified it may seem at the moment. It's okay to receive a diagnosis that reads human condition. In fact, it's the only response that allows the connection with others I didn't even know I was missing. Today I continue to work on the path, and I continue to uncover my heart's true nature as I cultivate a mind-body connection that responds to life with love and with compassion. The judgmental and belittling voices still show up, but I say hello, and I let them continue on their way. I now feel ease and comfort while experiencing life as it unfolds, along with a deep knowing that drinking or drugging or eating or anything will not fix what's not broken. Thank you guys. Next one up will be Pablo on page, if you have the book, 151. Namaste, guys. And I'll leave you with this. Much love to you guys. Buenas noches.